Root.
Okay, that goes over there.
No.
This one's back here.
No. No.
Let's get that straightened out with share the screen. There.
Huh.
And I'll just give it a second for people to log in, as is usual.
Bye.
Hope everyone's doing well.
Too much rain this week.
Huh.
Yeah, and it's Nathaniel's birthday.
It is indeed Nathaniel's birthday.
Right.
I don't think it's connected to the rain, though.
No.
And we could be getting more, depending upon what the hurricane does. We shall see. Just another minute for people to get set up, and then we'll start. I hope people are also taking some time on this 11th day of the 11th month to do a little Hakarat Hatov, recognition and showing appreciation to those who have been veterans for our country or whichever country you are in. And it looks like I think we've waited just about long enough. People will join as they want to join. So we're going to begin Parashat Chayei Sarah at the end of Parashat Chayei Sarah. Excuse me. The parasha is, of course, best known for two main things: the passing of Sarah and the purchase of the cave of Machpelah in Hebron for her burial, and then the finding of a bride, meaning Rebecca, for Isaac. But there is a third component to this parasha, and that is the last section of Abraham's life. His marriage to Keturah, who may or may not be Hagar. There's some debate among the commentators on that. His siring of numerous other children through Keturah, and then the section we're going to look at, which is Abraham's final passing from this world. So Chayei Sarah contains the passing of both Abraham and Sarah. Sarah gets more screen time only because many people, they see genealogies at the end and they sort of begin skipping pages. But trust me, there are good things here, and hopefully we will uncover them together today. So let's go ahead then and start. We are in chapter 25, as you can see from Sefaria here, and we are beginning with verse 5, after we have just had the description of the genealogy of Abraham's other sons. Abraham willed all that he owned to Isaac. In particular, it's Vayiten. He gave all that he owned to Isaac. But to Abraham's sons by concubines, by the other people that he had been with, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living, and he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. So there seems to be a sharp line being driven that the vast bulk of Abraham's estate is being transferred to Isaac, and a token of Abraham's appreciation, love, however you want to put it, is being given to the children born by others, meaning not Sarah. And they are not only being given a gift, but also given a destination, meaning they are not being invited to stay here in the land of Canaan, the land that will eventually be called Israel. But instead, even though they are part of Abraham's children, and even though this area is part of Abraham's inheritance, Abraham is saying, it's great, right over there, good place, go settle down, you're going to love it. He does not seem to want them to be around the settlement of Isaac, who will retain control and proper right to Israel exclusively. We continue on verse 7. This was the total span of Abraham's life, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. So we're going to have to come back to this line in a little bit, but I want you to just notice some of the phrasing here, right? V'yigva v'yamot, right? This is the double phrase that here is being used as Abraham breathed his last. V'yigva is a little bit more nebulous than just breathing his last. And in fact, it doesn't have necessarily the term breathing at all. Little Safario 101, if you're interested, you can always click, whoop, and it just jumped. Just a second. Come on. There we are. You can click on words, and it will give you the translation. And as you can see, Gava definitely has a notion of expiring or dying, but that is precisely what makes this unusual, because it is a possible synonym for vayamot, right? And he died doesn't make a lot of sense. However, some people will say he died content, or he died satisfied, right? V'seva tova, right? In a fullness of time. So it's a little bit unclear. And of course, anything that's ever unclear just means that we are going to have a conversation about that in our commentary. But do pay attention to this phrase of him passing at a good age. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, facing Mamre. You'll remember from the beginning of this parasha that this is the cave that he purchased for the burial of Sarah, and now he is being buried there as well. Sorry, I should have kept reading first before explaining that. The field that Abraham had bought from the Hittites, there Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled near Be'er Lachai Roi, right, near this other town. However, you're probably then expecting Isaac's story to continue, but instead, Ve'ela Toldot Yishmael. This is the generations, this is the line of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's slave, bore to Avraham. Shivchat can mean slave, handmaiden. It's not quite the same as a brain is working. The pileget. Sorry, my mouth. The concubine that we had up before. Sometimes consonants don't want to get in the right order in my mouth. So this is a slightly different status, and he has a slightly different story then. And so we're going to hear a little bit more about Ishmael and his family. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, by their names in the order of their birth. Nevayot, V'kedar, Ve'adbeel, Uvmivsham. I don't know about you, but I always find the Hebrew a little bit easier to read, right? Mishma, Duma, Masa, right? So those are more. And then in verse 15, we round it out with Hadad, V'tema, Yetur, Nafish, and Vakedma. Now these different sons all tend to have names that are similar to the tribal names or the region names that are found throughout mostly the Arabian Peninsula. Now, if anyone can count very, very quickly, you will see that he had how many sons?
12.
12, right? These are the 12 sons of Ishmael. We are also going to see many sons from Esav. And of course, we end up with 12 sons from Jacob. So this is one of the additional ways that God was fulfilling his promise of making the descendants of Abraham as numerous as the stars in the sky. Yes, that is often focused on as being connected to the Jewish people, but our commentators are also very honest that Abraham did not only sire the Jewish people, but also sired these other nations as well. And 12 is a symbol of a complete fullness of a huge branch of a family tree. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their villages and by their encampments, 12 chieftains of as many tribes. Then we get to verse 17. These are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. Then he breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his kin. All right, so what do we notice here? Well, we get a list of Ishmael's lifespan, and we also get v'yigva v'yamot, right? That same phrase of breathing his last and dying, and the same phrase as well that we had with Abraham of being gathered to his kin. Now, for those of you who are slightly more conversant in Hebrew, you'll see that the word amav is not the word for relatives. It is the word for people, or more specifically, his peoples, his nations would be another way of putting it. Something, again, that we'll have to consider. Oh, almost too far. They dwelt from Havilah by Shur, which is close to Egypt, all the way to Ashur. They camped alongside all their kinsmen. So it's trying to say that this region of different tribes that were founded through Ishmael's line found representatives that went all the way from Egypt, all the way up into Syria, and as I mentioned as well, into what we would call the Arabian Peninsula. So, any questions?
Yeah. It said previously that the children of his concubines, while he was still living, he gave them a portion and sent them to the east, right?
Yes.
And now, but those are not the children of Hagar and Ishmael. Are these a different 12?
Well, these 12 are definitely the children of Ishmael. The other people that are mentioned from Keturah are above that. I sort of skipped that section of this whole additional genealogy that comes at the beginning of chapter 25. So you can see there are a number of other people here. And the question is, like I said, the commentators have argued, is Keturah another name for Hagar? Or is Keturah a concubine? Or is Keturah an Isha, a wife, as she is called in the Hebrew? So that would imply, if she was a wife, whether or not she was Hagar or not, that would imply that the children of the Pilagshim, the concubines, would be a different people, meaning that we didn't hear about Abraham having concubines, but apparently he did. And these would be the other unnamed children that were born to the concubine. Like I said, this is a point of debate and argument among the commentators. Some say that Keturah wasn't really the full status of wife, and therefore she is more in this category. But even still, we're left with a plural category. Some then also include Hagar as being also in this status, but she is then called a Shivcha later on, which definitely has a higher status, and she is also called an Isha way back when Abraham first has Ishmael with her. So Abraham's marital status is complicated. It is not so simple. And there's a lot going on here and a lot of room for different commentary.
So these children of Hagar and Ishmael were,
Well, of Hagar's grandchildren.
were born after Sarah. Yeah, the grandchildren were born after Sarah died, or we don't know.
We don't know. We are given the story of their death. Of their existence after the death of Sarah, but we are not told when each of them was born, lived, and or was born and lived. We can almost certainly assume that they were, at least some of them, alive before she passed away. So we can't just say that Ishmael waited to get married and have children until after Sarah's passing. But that does lead us to the question, though, of why do we care about Ishmael's kids at all? Right? Why not just say, and Ishmael had a bunch of kids? Why give us names? Why give us the fact that we're even using the same type of language of, excuse me, right? And he lived the number of years of his lifespan. Why are we counting his life when we don't count so many others? Why are we using the same phrasing of he died in this very formal phrase? Why are we saying that he's gathered to his people? There's a lot of unnecessary detail here that shouldn't matter. Ishmael is not the main story. He is not the main event. He's a side branch. So why bother?
Rabbi?
Mm-hmm.
Asking about that verse 17, as compared to verse 8, we're told that Abraham, in contrast to Ishmael, is old and full of days. That he, what is the phrase? Old and contented in the Sefaria New JPS. We don't hear that Ishmael was contented. Or satisfied, just that, well, he's Abraham's son. He lived a long time, not as much as his brother lives, which we learn later. But that curious phrase to me of he's old and full of days, or old and satisfied. That's something that leaps out at me of why is he different? Why is Abraham different?
Right. So this middle phrase that I'm sort of moving here my mouse over in verse 8, right? That he was old and contented, that he was full of goodness. There's a number of different ways to translate this before we get to and was gathered to his kin is missing. That phrase is missing from our verse 17 when we find that Ishmael dies. We go straight from he died, again, strange synonyms there, and he was gathered to his kin. So the question is, why is that missing? And indeed, that is going to be part of our discussion of what did it mean in the first place of that, and what is this trying to tell us about Ishmael? So if there are no other questions or comments on the text directly, we're going to move into our commentary. Okay. So the Zohar starts off by trying to tell us a little bit about the days, the way that these days are counted, right? And it says, but the days of the righteous are eternal. This is as written, and Sarah's life was, and these are the days of Abraham's life which he lived. If you say it is also written of Ishmael, and these are the years of the life of Ishmael, right? Even though he was not righteous, this is only because he repented. Therefore it is written, these are of his days as of Abraham. So what the Zohar is saying, and others are going to echo, so just wait and see, is that the reason why Ishmael gets a mention and is sharing the same terminology that is used for Abraham and Sarah's life is because Ishmael became righteous. Ishmael did tshuva. Ishmael became a good person. Yes, we know of the prophecy that was given when Hagar left and the angel was saving Ishmael, that he would be a man of the bow and a man against other people. But this is implying that Ishmael is worthy of recording, not just as recording, but is also worthy of sharing the same technical terminology, because he was a good person by the end of his life, and therefore deserves the recognition of using that kind of titled language when giving his the account of his passing. However, this seems to be in contrast with what we know of Ishmael, and also of what we would expect from Abraham, and what we just saw him do. In particular, Da'at Sekenim points out that Abraham gives everything to Isaac, right? That doesn't seem right for a number of reasons. He points out one, right? How could he have done so, giving everything to Isaac, seeing that the Talmud, Bava Batra 133, denies a father the right to transfer his estate even from an unworthy son to a worthy son. Right? The Talmud is very clear that according to Jewish law, you cannot cut someone out of your will because you don't think they are worthy. Right? The inheritance is the inheritance that they deserve to receive. Done. Your opinions don't really enter into it. Gifts while living are a little different, but that's a whole other discussion for halakha sometime. But what he's pointing out is, it seems like Abraham is violating this principle. Now, why would they say that you should give what they are owed, regardless of their worthiness when it comes to an inheritance? The reason being that the son from whom his potential inheritance is taken away may have a worthy son himself, whereas the son to whom it has been transferred may have an unworthy son. So what it's pointing out is that you may think that son number one is the most righteous kid ever, but when you give to him, he will then give to his children, and his children, your grandchildren, may be absolute, terrible people, and vice versa. Son number two may be an unforgivable wretch, but he may end up with an incredibly righteous son, your grandson, for whom you would be only too happy for your inheritance to be going to. So trying to predict where your inheritance will do the most good based upon the current goodness of an individual is a mistaken proposition. And thus Da'at Sekenim is scratching his head saying, how could Abraham have done this? Now he's implying that Abraham might have done this because the other sons were not as worthy. But he is still coming back to the idea that, yeah, but that's not a good enough reason, because sorting it by worthiness doesn't really work in Judaism, because we don't know the ultimate worthiness of the bequeath that we are given. Questions or comments at that point?
But Abraham's a prophet.
But Abraham's a prophet. Abraham is indeed a prophet. But are we then to say that none of the people that came from these tribes were worthy?
No, it just means sometimes the rules are different with the prophets. Jacob, for example, marrying sisters.
Well, rules are, I would argue rules are sometimes different for the prophets that were born before the Torah was given. Once the Torah was given, then we are generally locked into doing it prophet or not. Even Moses was bound by the halakha, was bound by Jewish law. He couldn't pick and choose because he was a prophet. So that doesn't exactly cover everything. The best excuse we can give is this was pre-Torah. Of course, for those who believe that Abraham fulfilled every part of Torah, even those that hadn't been given yet, in a literal sense, this is a more challenging point. But
there's also something about which we don't talk about so much, but modern feminists would, is that Sarah's son. And Sarah herself is a prophet, and Sarah herself was a leader of that community. And so Isaac is different because he is Sarah's son. Ishmael is Hagar's son. And Sarah, in her own right, was a co-leader. It was because of her that Abraham got much of what was his. both out of Egypt and from Avimelech.
Right. So, and that's perfectly fair, as long as we're also willing to acknowledge that this does not conform to Jewish law as the Torah later gives us. The idea being that you're not allowed to decide between the favorite wife and the not favorite wife when sharing your inheritance. Right? The Torah explicitly, very deliberately tells us that is not the way that we handle things when it comes to inheritances. So it is a little shocking to see Abraham behave in this way, even if he and Sarah both had very good reasons why they would be showing preference for Isaac.
But if some of that property was really Sarah's, and they, when she died, went to Abraham and then went to Isaac, that you know, that kind of makes sense.
We can argue a little bit about that, but I will remind you that as far as the Torah goes, the property did belong to Abraham. Whether or not she was instrumental in having it be brought into the household, which certainly she was, the actual ownership of the property was his. In any case, let's turn our attention back to Ishmael. Yes.
I was going to say, the Torah points out that Isaac and Ishmael bury Abraham. Correct. So there can't be that, I mean, by the fact that they're together and sided together must mean that there maybe is not that hard of feelings, or I think it's unique that they're both there and they're both noted and they both take the responsibility of burying their father. So there has to be something good.
The fact that the two brothers or half brothers are together to bury Abraham is definitely something that is picked up on by numerous commentators and midrashim of trying to also justify the notion that Ishmael was different, that Ishmael was not a wild man, that he was not a violent man, at least at this point in his life. Because otherwise, the fact that he would be there and share that honor with his brother Isaac is just simply inconceivable. However, there is a different explanation of why the years of Ishmael's life are recorded. Right? Why give us this number of years at all? Rav Chia, the son of Abba, asked, why are the years of Ishmael enumerated? In order to trace through them the years of Jacob. That is to say, the years in which various incidents of his life happened. So the argument that Rashi is bringing here is that when the Torah was being put down, we needed a couple different benchmarks in order to keep track of the time, to know when different things might have happened, what was the time span. And by including the days of Ishmael, which we can mark from when he was born until when he died, it gives us a timeline on which we can then also place the lives of Isaac and then also of Jacob. So it's more mundane, is what Rashi is saying here, based off the tradition. But it is also interesting that Rashi chose to use this interpretation, that this life of Ishmael was purely a timeline convenience, rather than using the other interpretations that we saw in the Zohar and that others will also bring, that it was because Ishmael was deserving in his own right, even if he was not the primary line that we are going to follow. He was still deserving of having at least this coda to his life to show that he was a better person than you might have thought. And indeed, Ramban, Nachmanides, is going to bring up this idea and share it. So this next paragraph here is from him. These were the years of Ishmael's life. The likely explanation is that the Torah generally relates of the righteous the names of their offspring and the number of the years of their life, in order to tell us that the offspring of the righteous shall be blessed, right? If you're getting a list of a person's life and you're getting all the kids they have, then generally speaking, we have to interpret that as applying in this case as well. Right? In the teaching of our rabbis, many reasons are given for the reporting of the Ishmael's lifespan. The most satisfying one is that he became righteous and repented, and it is recorded as it does for other righteous men. So Ramban is taking a very straightforward view that the general pattern of the way the Torah records things is it doesn't waste ink on this level of detail for somebody that wasn't righteous. Therefore, if it's here, we have to believe that Ishmael was righteous. And if he wasn't before, then that merely means that he repented, that he came back to a righteous path. Again, it doesn't mean that it's going to be establishing the brit, the covenant through him, but it does mean that we have to acknowledge that there was goodness in Ishmael, according to what Ramban thinks is the simplest interpretation of the text. And he expired, our interesting double death language at the end. A quote from Rashi: expiring is only stated by the righteous. This actually comes from the Talmud. Now, what is he talking about here? It's again, talking about this interesting v'yigva, this unusual phrase that's being used, saying, why is that word being used here? Because that word is only used for the righteous. However, in the Gemara they ask, but expiring was said of the generation of the flood, right? It says, and all the flesh that moves on earth expired, and all mankind, and all that is on earth shall expire. Again, using the same verb in all of these places. So we know they weren't righteous, they were getting wiped out. But it answers, we mean to say the expression expiring and being gathered to one's people is only said by the righteous. You need two parts. The person expired, using this verb, or breathed their last, as the JPS translation gives it, and gathered to their people or their kin. If you have both together as a linked set, then you know that you are talking about a righteous person. Their intention is that expiring refers to death without painful sickness and suffering. And except for the righteous, people don't merit this. Now, the men of the generation of the flood were overturned in a moment, and no hands were laid on them. So the reason why they also get this verb is not because they were righteous, but because their death came in a flash. And when death comes like that, also, there is no lingering pain and suffering from sickness. So they got a kind of a break because their death was quick, but we can't call them righteous because we don't have the additional phrase, and they were gathered to their kin, they were gathered to their people. Questions or reflections on that? Okay. He was gathered into his people. Ibn Ezra writes that this is a description of the honor being paid to the soul of the deceased. While the relatives are busy with interring the physical remains of the deceased, his soul rises to the celestial regions, this being the first time that the body and soul are each going their separate ways. So this phrase of being gathered to his people is also something that is a little confusing. What do we know from Lech Lecha? What do we know from the very first lines of God's instructions to Abraham about heading out to the land of Israel? What is he leaving behind? Anybody remember that far back from a couple weeks ago?
His kinspeople.
Yeah, the land of your people, the land of your kin, the land of your ancestors. So we know
he's leaving behind his people,
exactly
his city, his ancestors.
So
everything.
He left behind everything, and we see explicitly again here in our chapters of Chayei,
except for his father and brothers.
Well, but eventually he leaves them behind as well when he leaves Haran. He ends up being buried only with Sarah, right? That is the only person that he is being buried with, and he's being buried in a land where none of his other relatives are buried. And yet we are saying he's being gathered to his people. If that's meant simply to be buried among the family tomb, that really doesn't apply so well in this case, since it's already been highlighted that Abraham was leaving behind his ancestral holdings in either Ur-Kasdim or Haran. But what Ibn Ezra is hinting at here, and Torah Aruch is expanding on, is that when a person dies, their body is interred where it is, but it is the gathering of the soul that is being referred to here, not the gathering of the bones. That it is the soul that is going to the celestial regions, and as such, we can begin to see a hint of the afterlife being a gathering of people, even if their physical remains are separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. And indeed, that is precisely the way Sforno is going to expand upon it in our next text. He was attached, meaning when he was gathered, he was attached to the bundle of souls who are part of the life after death. So just a quick reminder of this phrase of asaf, of being gathered. You have to think like a farmer who is gathering the crops. In one arm, you have all of the things you've already gathered, the sheaves of wheat. And then when you gather a new one, you add it to that bundle. So this is the metaphor that's being used in this vocabulary. All of those that are being gathered, all of whom the righteous of the various generations who were like him in lifestyle, right? Meaning, according to the editor, as in those regions, biological relations are irrelevant, meaning in the world to come, biology doesn't matter. And the term his people is applied to other common denominators than on earth. Right? This is not just about the nation you are in, meaning which flag you have or which passport is stamped, but is referring to the broader concept of peoples that are linked together by righteousness. The reason why the Torah employs the term his peoples in the plural is that there are all kinds of different spiritual levels among the righteous souls. Not all attained the same level of righteousness while on earth, although all of them share the experience of enjoying eternal life. And you can look in Bava Batra and the Talmud on page 75 for more on that topic. So the notion here is that Abraham is being gathered not to his people, meaning his relatives per se, but Sforno is arguing he's being gathered to among the righteous. But of course, that also then means when we interpret the text regarding Ishmael, who is also being gathered to his people, his Amav, that we have to, if we follow Sforno's interpretation, see that he is also being gathered to the righteous, which is, again, reminding us that Ishmael had righteousness as one of his characteristics. Now, we can also take from the second half of the Sforno commentary that not all righteous people are exactly the same, that there are different degrees of righteousness, but it would still seem to imply that Ishmael made the cut, that he did have righteousness enough to merit his place in the world to come. Thoughts or comments? Because Radak is going to argue with this, as I'm sure you've already noticed by looking down on the page. The Torah applies this expression, meaning to be gathered to one's people, to one's family regardless of whether they were righteous people or sinners. Radak takes a more concrete view, if you will, a mundane view, that it really does mean kinsmen, that you don't need to interpret this as being peoples or the righteous groups of the world, but instead, no, this is just an idiom, and it means your family. And we use it whether your family was good or not. All right, remember, we know from the story of Abraham, at least the way the rabbis understand it, that the rest of his relatives were not great. We know from at least the Midrashim that Abraham was raised in an idolatrous world, and his family were almost certainly keepers of idols and practicing idolatry. So is it really appropriate that he's being gathered to them? And Radak is saying, no. It's just a phrase, right? When you die, this is what we say, that you are gathered to your family. We're not going to make distinctions. We're not going to list which of the family you are gathered to because some are good and some are bad. It's just an idiom. and as an idiom, you should not read it too literally. So Radak is trying to simplify our understanding here rather than looking for the additional insights that Sforno and Tur Aruch and Ibn Ezra were taking from this phrase. Again, we always see that commentary will usually allow for multiple interpretations to give us important insights in and of themselves. And here, Radak, whether you agree with the ultimate conclusion in the debate of exactly who is being gathered to whom in the afterlife, at least is reminding us that a family is a family, regardless of the relative merit of the different members of that family.
Rabbi,
yes,
bolstering Radak's argument, I mean, when we open up our Shabbat prayers with the prayer for the gift of the soul, acknowledging the purity of individual souls, the soul itself is pure, and if it's the soul that is being gathered, that is the pure part of our essence that comes from the Almighty, that comes from the Holy One. So that, that certainly does fit in with that idea that regardless of whether we're righteous people or sinners, the soul is still pure.
Right. So, I mean, rabbinic teachings may sometimes argue in hyperbolic language of who does or who doesn't have a share in the world to come. But by and large, when push comes to shove and they really get down to trying to agree on some of these points, almost all of the authorities are really reluctant to say that any of the sort of regular kind of people would ever not have a share in the world to come. You have to become a world-class evil before you face oblivion rather than some form of world to come existence. They still argue about many of the details, of course, but yes, the rabbis in general, apart from, like I said, their hyperbole for trying to encourage you to behave well, generally are leaving the door open for just about everyone in existence. So Radak continues, and we're going to move on to the second half of our discussion with this idea of Abraham being satisfied. Again, a phrase that we didn't see applied to Ishmael. So whether or not we can call him satisfied, yes, it doesn't seem that he had that, but whether or not he was righteous, I personally would argue that the commentators are making a good argument that he probably was righteous, but that doesn't mean that he was satisfied. But what does it mean to be satisfied? Well, Radak argues that this satisfaction we find with regards to Abraham means that he is satisfied having seen children and grandchildren and having been treated with respect and dignity all his life. Right? This is a minimum measure of satisfaction. Right? It wasn't that he had a Lamborghini. It wasn't that he was the ruler of the world. It wasn't that he left behind giant monuments. He was satisfied. He'd had a family. His family had family, and he had a dignified life. Doesn't mean that he was a ruler over others. It just meant his life was a life of dignity. And if that's what you can say at the end of your days, that, arguing Radak, that should make you feel satisfied with the life that you have had. And if only more people use that as their measure, I think we'd find many people who were much happier in their life. But that's not the only explanation. Let me just go ahead and scroll down. I can't quite get them both on, so we'll stick with Tur HaAruch at first, and then we'll scroll down for our final comment. In a ripe old age, what does this mean? This fullness of time? He had seen all his aspirations fulfilled. The Torah here describes an attitude to life by the pious who do not demand more than has been granted to them by God's grace without their pleading for this. So think for a moment of the first half. He'd seen all his aspirations fulfilled. That could seem very maximalist, that he had everything a person could ever want. But the second half is trying to say, no, he wanted everything he had, not he got everything he wanted. Right? Abraham's mindset, indeed the mindset of a righteous or pious person, is that what you have should be what you aspire to have. You should be satisfied with what you have. Right? Your aspirations should not exceed what you have been blessed with, that you need to recognize that blessing, to recognize that the worthy aspirations you might have indeed been fulfilled. And that is a change of mindset that many find hard, and especially in the modern world, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, where we have been told to aspire and aspire and aspire to many different things, whether it be material wealth, whether it be power, whether it be status seeking. We've been told never be satisfied, never be satisfied. To hear that you should actually find a way to be satisfied precisely with what you have can seem a bit jarring. It's not what the commercials tell me. And yet Torah is telling me that that is the definition of a pious person. And by the way, I should also point out the fact that this needed to be explained to our ancestors hundreds of years ago as well lets us know that although we have taken it to the nth degree with our consumer culture, that people have always struggled with this concept. And indeed, let's go ahead and finish off with Ramban before we discuss this further, because Ramban is going to explain this in a little bit more detail. This satisfaction, this means that he realized all the desires of his heart and sated with all good things. And likewise by Isaac, it says he was sated with days, that his soul was sated with days and he had no desire for his days to provide anything new for him. Like it says by David, then he died in a good old age, sated with days, wealth, and honor. This is a description of God's kindness towards the righteous and of his benevolence to them, that they shouldn't crave extravagances. As it says about them, you have given him his heart's desires, from Psalm 21. Unlike what it says about other people, he who loves money shall never be sated with money, about which the rabbi said, no man leaves this world with half of his desires fulfilled. If he has 100 dinars, 100 coins, he wants 200. If he has 200, he wants to make them 400. Like it says, he who loves money shall never be sated with money. So Ramban is making it even more explicit that they didn't make their satiation, they didn't make their satisfaction dependent upon things, because to be dependent upon things would always be to be yearning for more of those things. There is no way to have it all. You cannot win by chasing after a certain number for your satisfaction. Instead, you have to be satisfied with what you actually possess and recognize that through that can come a fulfilling and meaningful life. Bereshit Rabbah says, God shows the righteous their reward that he is going to give them in the next world, and their souls become content, and they go to their eternal rest. That a person recognizes that how much you have in this world in any sort of material or superficial way simply can't compare to eternity being embraced through having had a life of goodness and righteousness. Right? The material it doesn't measure up. And when you have that insight, when you can see what I could gain through material means in this world and what I can obtain through immaterial righteous deeds for an eternal time in the world to come, it's just they don't even come close to being on the same scale. It's like one doesn't even exist, as anything compared to infinity, of course, usually is basically zero. So Ramban is trying to remind us that that is the ultimate perspective that Abraham had, as did Isaac and as did many others. Unfortunately, as was already pointed out, we don't see that with Ishmael. And we can imagine that although he was able to find his measure of righteousness in life, he perhaps was not able to find his measure of satisfaction. And given how he grew up, and given the trials and problems that he faced, that shouldn't surprise us. But we should also recognize that many others have also grown up under harsh conditions and difficult trials and tribulations, and yet were able to feel a measure of satisfaction and fullness in life, even without having everything that their body may have wanted. Additional questions or comments?
It seems like I can't remember where exactly in Psalm where David says, that he wants to be in God's courtyards. Um, just a gatekeeper in your courtyards. But this idea that what Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have and David have is they have a close relationship with Adonai early in their life, through their life, and at the end of their life. And that's what satisfies them.
Right, and finding that satisfaction is, so critical. And I believe, the psalm you're referring to is the psalm that we recite during the time of Tshuva. It's a psalm that we recite between the beginning of the month of Elul and through the high holidays, the Yamim Noraim. And it's precisely because it is, teaching us many, many lessons. But that one phrase that you are quoting there is reminding us that our ultimate goal should not be to amass wealth, power, status in this world, but instead to amass a connection to God. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Yeah. I have a little problem with it saying that Isaac, it says, and sated with day, that Isaac, it seems like Isaac was blind. He couldn't identify his own children. He misidentified the children, and then he had no blessing to give to Esau. I mean, his days were pretty rough.
Yes, but that doesn't mean that he can't be satisfied. Right. So, the amazing thing about Abraham is, although we think of him as being this incredibly successful and amazing guy, and although people often will compare Isaac as being a little bit less materially successful, as we've talked in some previous classes about that, the truth is Abraham may have had some material success, but he also came close to losing it multiple times. And the stresses that were put into his life were not insignificant, not least of which was almost, sacrificing his son Isaac. So the illusion that you can only have a satisfied life if the life has been devoid of trouble, that the life has somehow missed all of the challenges that make life painful, simply is not the view that the Torah is giving us here. The Torah and the commentaries are trying to say you can be sated without having everything that a person thinks needs to be checked off their list for what is a meaningful, fulfilling, and good life. A good life can be achieved even in the worst of circumstances.
Rabbi, yes. I think whether it's Job or Psalms, that many are the afflictions of the righteous, the Lord delivers them from them all. And certainly with Abraham's trials and a life that was so improbable that, everything that he went through to survive and to thrive, even with all those afflictions, and the same thing with Isaac and Jacob, these are so unexpected.
Right, but and even with the afflictions, it's not the absence of afflictions that make life make a life good. Right? It's not that even when it says God delivers them, it doesn't mean that God will cancel all the afflictions. It means that yes, they will survive them. Hurt, damaged, scarred, impoverished, yes, all of those things. But that does not prevent us from having a meaningful, fulfilling, and satisfied life. And the sooner we as a society remember that, the healthier we are all going to be.
Right, I agree.
All right, well, on that note of unanimous consensus, which is always rare, let's go ahead and stop for today. Although, of course, you're welcome to join for the Mishnah class tonight at 7 o'clock. And everybody continue to study and read the parasha. Remember, as we keep seeing, Sefaria has great commentaries for you to browse on your own. And we will continue our discussion with Isaac's life next week. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Bye-bye.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.